Hello everyone and welcome to this new webinar on clinical practice guidelines. Today we are going to talk about the risk of bias. The main objective of this webinar is to show you how to assess the risk of bias in all studies included in our review. We are going to show you a list of tools we will use for this risk of bias assessment, and we are going to focus on two of them because we are expecting to have two types of studies mainly. Lastly, just to strike on risk of bias, assessing precision, internal validity, and external validity. So the tools we are going to use for our included studies are these you have now on the screen. For RCTs and quasi-randomized trials, we are going to use the Cochrane risk of bias tool, which is mainly based on Refman, Review Manager, but probably we are going to use an Excel spreadsheet because it's easy for all of us. In terms of control before and after studies, and also for interrupted time series, we are going to use the risk of bias criteria for the Epoch reviews, which is a guide for review authors on assessing studies quality. It's quite easy. It's very similar to the Cochrane risk of bias tool, but it's focused mainly on the domains related to this type of studies. And lately, for those observational studies, both prospective and retrospective, which probably are the main of the studies we have included, we are going to use the Newcastle-Ottawa scale. So in the following slides, we are going to talk about the Cochrane risk of bias tool and the Newcastle-Ottawa scale. So Cochrane risk of bias tool is a tool based on 7 domains. The domains are 6 main domains, and the 7th could be other type of bias. So the first one is the random sequence generation, the second one allocation concealment, the third one blinding of participants and personnel, the fourth blinding of outcomes assessment, the fifth is incomplete outcome data, the sixth selective outcome report, and last other type of bias. So the common classification you can see here, this is a table taken from the Cochrane handbook. You can see that the name of the bias related to the domains sequence generation and allocation concealment is called the selection bias. The performance bias is related to the blinding of participants and personnel and other threats that can affect the validity. The detection bias is related to the blinding of outcome assessment, and the attrition bias related to incomplete outcome data, and reporting bias and how the data are reported in a selective way. So to use the Cochrane risk of bias tool, we are going to have 2 different components per domain. So the first component is the judgment. That is, when you go through the paper, you have to make a judgment about the risk of bias. You can just judge is a low risk of bias, a high risk of bias, or unclear one. And then the second component is how you support your judgment. If you want to quote something from the text, you can do it. Just copy and paste a line or a couple of lines. And if you want to make a comment, instead of copying and pasting some information from the study, then you can write down the comment. In the way, once you have done your judgment and include your comments, then we need to present the assessment. We are going to use one summary table and 2 types of figures. So the summary table is this one. You can see in the first column on the left all the bias we have talked about before. The next column, author's judgment. You need to put here your judgment, high, low, or unclear, and then you can see the support of the judgment. As I mentioned before, you can say quote, columns, and then put the exact words taken from the article, or you can make a comment. In this case, you write down comment columns and you can make your comment. In terms of figures, we have 2 types of figures. The one on the left, where you can see all the risk of bias in a column, and on the right, a bar showing the 100% of the studies And by colors, you can see if this bias has more percentage of low risk bias, judgment, or unclear or high. And the other one on your right, you can see it's a table, it's a matrix, where you can see by rows all the studies and by columns all the bias. Then in each of the cells, you can see a colored dot that means low in green and clear yellow or high in red, and also a small sign, a positive sign saying it's low, an interrogation which means unclear, and a negative signal which means high risk of bias. So these are the way we present the assessment, one table and two figures. It's important for all of us that trying not to assume that the risk of bias is the same for all the outcomes. That means some outcomes could be very affected, for example, by blinding, but other outcomes can not be affected. So in these cases, probably we need to make a double assessment. Probably we need to assess the risk of bias for a group of outcomes and another one for another group of outcomes. For example, if we are talking about the mortality, there is a low risk of bias even if performance bias is detected. I mean, if we have no randomized people can affect, but the blinding is not affecting the results. And also, if pain measured with an algometer, there is a high risk of bias if the outcome assessor is not blinded, because there is a kind of subjectiveness in this measure. The other tool we are expecting to use more is the Newcastle-Ottawa scale. So this scale has been constructed by assessing the quality of non-randomized studies in meta-analysis. So basically for cohort studies and case controls, we are going to check in the cohort studies how the selection is done, how comparable are the cohorts, and how the outcome is assessed. And the same for the case control studies, how selection of case and controls can be done, how the comparability of case and controls, and some kind of ascertainment of exposure. So this scale trying to identify high quality choices with a star. So we use stars to assess each of the items included in this scale. We can put a maximum of 1 star for each of the items within the selection, exposure categories, and a maximum of 2 for comparability. I'm going to show you now. As you can see in the screen, we have 3 different blocks for this scale for cohort studies. So we have selection with 4 items, comparability with 1 item, and outcome with 3 items. So you can use each of these questions, and you can put a star in the sections where only 1 star is available, or 2 stars in the sections where you can use 2. For case control studies, works in the same way. So the maximum score is 4 for selection, 1 for comparability, and 3 for exposure. So a study can be awarded with a maximum of 1 star for each number item I showed you before within the selection and exposure, and a maximum of 2 stars in comparability, right? So this is a brief explanation of how we are going to work with the risk of bias. In case you have any question, just can drop us an email, and we can clarify any issue you have. Okay, thank you very much.